Wonderful. I'm going to follow on where we got to since Sunday. We started with looking at desire. How many of you were there Sunday for the? So it's kind of most of you. So I'm going to kind of just do a quick recap on what we've said, so that we can trace the story further and bring it to a beautiful conclusion this evening. So we started off the first session by looking at our reflective nature, that the very thing that defines humanity, according to Genesis, but also according to neurology, psychology, all these sciences says the same thing about humanity. We are reflective beings more than any other creature. We are able to not only reflect one another's actions, but there's something about us that can actually reflect the desires and the intentions of others. So number one, we are reflective beings. Number two, the quality that is reflected most unconsciously is desire. It's a quality that we don't even know, a movement that we don't even know is being transmitted all the time. In fact, desire is such it has got such a stealth about it. It's such a subtle movement that we don't even notice it until it's present. And normally we then assume that we are the creators or the originators of our own desire, not realizing that desire is continually suggested to us by whatever we encounter, and mostly by the community and the people that we are in relationship with, are constantly busy suggesting to us what is desirable. And so in the two sessions that we did then on Sunday, the first part was looking at really the positive side of desire. So there's a very positive side in which desire, intimate relationship would not be possible without desire. Why are we attracted to one another? Why would we want any kind of relationship if there is no intention or desire? So the Genesis 1 picture imagines a very positive cycle of desire between man and God as God adores us, and that adoration is reflected back to Him. That's a cycle in which desire has its origin in a God who is complete, who is full, who is satisfied, not out of a sense of lack, but out of a sense of fullness. He desires to give Himself. And this self-giving God becomes the love that we reflect back. And so 1 John says we love because He first loved us. He's the initiator. And what is love but the desire to give yourself for the benefit of someone else? Okay. And so right at the beginning, we see a God who gives His own image and likeness. Am I at the right spot or whatever? Great. Okay. A God who gives His own image and likeness to man. A God who doesn't withhold. A God who's not stingy. A God who's not afraid of rivalry. But a God who just abandons Himself in His love for us. And then we we start seeing the exact inverse of desire when we started moving towards Genesis 3, where the suggestion is made that God is actually withholding, that God doesn't want you to be like Him. And that's why He doesn't want you to partake of this fruit. And so the moment in which man perceives God as one who withholds, a sense of lack, a sense of inferiority sets in, and that desire becomes twisted. Now we want this fruit more than any other fruit. Because why? Because we want to be like God. Why? Because somehow we sense a lack of being. The truth is that the true God does not withhold His likeness. The truth is that the true God gives His own likeness and His own image freely to us. But in Genesis 3, we start seeing the confusion, the deception that enters in, where the suggestion is made that God is actually withholding. And He doesn't want us to have this fruit because He doesn't want us to be like Him. And so the moment man misinterprets the intention of God, we start reflecting the God of our confusion. And so, because we are reflective beings, you're going to reflect something or someone. And so in this picture, we suddenly see that the result of a misconception of God, because within this reflective nature that we have, there's a lot of space for interpretation. There's a lot of space for us deconstructing the information that's presented to us and reconstructing it and building our own little ideas. That's why two people experiencing the exact same event could have very different experiences, because each one of us takes the raw data, we break it down, we deconstruct it, we interpret it, we put it back together again, we try and fit it in with a pattern of memories, because somehow this got to make sense with everything I've experienced before, and we look for a way in which whatever we experience needs to confirm what I believe about myself and God. And so we can even take an event that is the exact an event that contradicts everything you believed before, and you'll find a way to make it confirm whatever you've believed before, because that's just the way in which we're wired. Things has got to make sense. And so within this pattern in which we continually deconstruct and reconstruct, something happened in humanity's prehistoric past in which we misconceived who God was. And we went from a place of awe at a God who gives Himself into a place of anxiety and fear of a God who withholds Himself. And suddenly our lives begins to be motivated out of this position of lack and this position of fear. And we no longer reflect the God whom we encounter face to face. We now begin to reflect the God of our own making, the God that we've created in our own image. And so our own confusion and our own fears are projected onto this God. And so many of the images that we have in the conversation that happens throughout the scriptures are man's projections of who God is and not God himself. Until Jesus comes and says, Hebrews says he is the exact representation of the character and the nature of God, and we'll get to that in session 2. But what I want to do a little bit further in this first session is show you how this, very quickly, show you how this fits in with human history. And I've got much more comprehensive material on it, but I want to put desire in its context anthropologically. In other words, not just individually. I think most of what we've spoken up until now can be applied to me personally. But the gospel story is not just about you personally. God has got the world in mind. God thinks about society, thinks about community, thinks about relationships. So what the heck does our desires have to do with how society is formed? Now, some of the most amazing thinkers that have looked back at the prehistoric past of humanity, and that's no small task. I mean, most of all us are kind of just about making sense of our own lives to try and make sense of humanity's whole history. We've got this way of just simplifying everything and convincing ourselves that we understand it, but it is a very complex task. To understand all of human history. But so much work has been done on it, and I just want to share a few of the just beautiful conclusions that these people have come to. They have found that in most ancient civilizations that they've unearthed through archaeology, or that is one part, and another part through which we know a lot about fairly ancient societies is through their literature, although it might be myth. The people who know how to deconstruct myths can actually find some very key factors in it that tells us something about the society that originally wrote it. So in archaeology, they found that most ancient civilizations has got some common features. Now, this is an important discovery, because what took humanity from little tribes who basically was formed around family groups, what took us from that very small, isolated groups to a place where we could work together in unity and create a society? Because most of those groups, when they got together, the result was not unity, the result was violence. But something at some time happened that allowed different tribes to suddenly overcome their violence and work together in unity. Now, why was there violence in the first place? Because desire means that if you want the biggest black and white horse, suddenly I know what I want. But there's only so many black and white horses around, and when people start competing for the same resource, and there are no laws to prohibit the competition, competition often then escalates into violence. But something happened, and so small communities coming together, there might be benefits. You think of hunter-gatherer communities, there might be benefits of us hunting together and gathering together, but often these groups would destroy one another or be dispersed because of the conflict in a society in which there were no laws. And so some of the most ancient laws, together with the biblical laws, are laws that prohibit violence. That is the main problem. Violence overflows. And so the common element that they found in all these ancient societies is the practice of human sacrifice. That's quite amazing. And so here's a scenario. Obviously, we don't have videotape evidence of this, but with all the evidence that we do have, this is what the anthropologists put together as the most convincing scenario as to why sacrifice is a universal phenomena, and not just any sacrifice, human sacrifice. You can imagine some of these tribes coming together, trying to work together. I see that you want the same horses we do, and so I start conniving. How can I get that horse instead of you? But there's only so many horses. So if my strategy doesn't work, and remember, because I know that you are a reflective being like me, I have the suspicion that you are also making some shrewd plans of taking the horse that I want. And very soon, because I'm watching for confirmation that you are trying to outdo me to get this horse, very soon I receive that confirmation. And in a society where there are very few laws, what would happen? I'll just steal it. I'll just take it. And what happens when you steal or take? This rivalry overflows into violence. And this is just one incident of many incidences of violence and conflict within our community. And we've been here before. This is just going to destroy our whole community unless we find a solution. And what humanity has found is at the height, at the most fervent point of our conflict with one another, when there's war, when there's a war of all against all, the way in which to preserve the community is to turn this war of all against all into a war of all against one. And we call that scapegoating. We call that the single victim mechanism, in which suddenly the whole community, knowing that they're going to just be disintegrated through this profane violence, finds a new kind of violence. And that is a violence in which we all draw our attention to a scapegoat, somebody that's just a bit different, somebody that might not have as many family connections or friends in the community, so that the reprisals are less likely. But as a community, a communal murder takes place. And this is what they found confirmed in all the myths as well. Most of the myths that tells of the beginning of their society has got the founding murder at the heart of the myth. Somebody died, and that event was the beginning of our community, of our society. Because suddenly what happens, all of us exert our frustration, our irritation. We are in a constant process of reflecting it. And you see, the thing is, I don't really want the horse. I think I want the horse. But the reason why I want that horse is because I have a sense of lack of being. What I really want is not just the horse, but I want your being. And so when competition enters into a place of rivalry, the object about which we compete becomes less and less important. And the rival becomes more and more important. And humans, like no other creatures, have got no limit to how we compete. Animals will come to a place where they realize if we continue, we're going to get hurt. So let's just stop it, you win, bye. But humans will carry on until somebody's dead. And so in this rivalry, when a community, you see, it wasn't Caiaphas who first thought of the idea that it's better for one man to die for the nation than for the whole nation to die. This is the way upon which societies have built their cities and their societies since the very dawn of humanity. And so we all reflect our own confusion, our own frustration, our own evil onto a scapegoat. A communal murder takes place, and the result is phenomenal. There is real peace that comes. There's nothing that reconciles old enemies better than finding a common new enemy. Suddenly, I'm no longer mad at you because you're competing for the horse. I mean, we have now found a way of expressing our irritation, and we now know what the problem was. We had this suspicion it wasn't us. It was somebody else, and here we found it. It's the scapegoat, and the peace that is the result of the sacrificing of the scapegoat is a confirmation that, yes, the scapegoat was guilty. And our myths begin out of this event because somehow the profane violence that was about to destroy our community has been overturned by a new kind of violence. We call it sacred violence or sacrifice. So religion is born out of the most horrific, satanic, what is satanos? Accusation. Suddenly when we stop pointing fingers at one another and we all point to one. And this is the accusation. And this is Satan casting out Satan, the very Satan that caused the confusion within the community. Also solves the chaos through this single victim mechanism, and so he's got the whole society neatly wrapped up. He causes the confusion and he brings peace through the single victim mechanism. That's why the Satanos in conversation with Jesus says, why don't you just bow to my way of doing things? Because the kingdoms of this world, I've got it all neatly wrapped up. I am the prince of the kingdoms, or the principle by which the kingdoms of this world operate. Wow. And that is through accusation that causes both chaos and unity. And so all the laws becomes focused to try and prevent violence. So let me give you an example from the Ten Commandments. But the Ten Commandments is kind of very similar to commands that we have in Syria, in Babylon, from all over the world. They try to reduce violence. So from command 6 onwards, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness. And it's like the writer can go on and on and on. Let's get to the heart of the problem. What really is the problem? What causes all this conflict? You shall not desire what belongs to your neighbor. I want to entitle this message, Don't Desire Your Neighbor's Ass. That is the old King James version. The new King James version says, don't desire your neighbor's donkey. Okay, but you get the point. There's a way in which desire can be twisted in such a way that it brings us into competition, into rivalry. And if rivalry is not contained, it leads to all kinds of suspicious dealing. If that's not contained, it leads to stealing. If that's not contained, I'll take what is most precious to you. Do not commit adultery. Because you see, what I really want is not what belongs to you. I want to replace you. And if that's not checked, it leads to murder. You shall not murder. And so this same process is is repeated over and over and over, and they've discovered it in all the myths. They've discovered it in ancient societies. Sacrifice, human sacrifice, is the key to taking little bandits of tribes who's continually involved in violence, but religion becomes the means by which violence is contained, because it replaces profane violence with sacred violence. Now, can you see how desire is really at the heart of this problem? What really happened in this community? See, 6 months later, after the initial murder, the same conflict, the same problems are back. Why? Because we've never dealt with the heart of the problem. The problem was never the scapegoat. The problem is we don't know what we want when we lose sight of the God who desires us. And so we continue in our confusion, and our frustration starts building again, and our irritation starts building again, until conflict starts boiling over again, and at the point at which the whole society is going to be destroyed, we remembered what worked last time: a human sacrifice. And so the initial founding murder becomes a ritual, and the ritual becomes a religion, and the religion controls violence, and it has tremendous benefits because it allows people to work together in unity. But with the tremendous benefits it brings, it also brings a tremendous blindness, a tremendous ignorance of your own nature and the nature of the society you are part of. Because what really happened is the evil that you projected on the scapegoat is the evil that you were unwilling to see in yourself. It's the evil that you cannot bear to believe concerning yourself. And this is the way in which we exercise our evil. We've lost sight of God, and now in our confusion, reflecting one another, the same cycle is just going to be repeated generation after generation. We just trade places. Sometimes we're the victim, sometimes we're the victimizer. But this cycle seems to be unbroken. And now, one of the great anthropologists and literary critics that studied all of this had a conversion experience, and to his absolute surprise, he discovered that this cycle was revealed in the scriptures. Like years and years of study of deconstructing the myths, because the myths contain both some truth, but there's also things that the myths always want to hide, because the myths are written by the survivors. And so the myths, in the myths, it means that the community is always innocent. It is the minority that is expelled, or the minority that is murdered. They're the guilty ones, obviously, because, we're innocent. And so the myths tell the same story over and over again, because the myths are written by the established order, by the survivors. And what it says is the community is right, the minority is wrong. There's gods who are angry at those who are wrong, and if we sacrifice them, the gods are pleased and they restore peace to our community. Now, René Girard, who studied and deconstructed all these myths, when he eventually started looking at the scriptures, he was amazed But first of all, the scriptures tells the same mythical stories, but at every point where the myths try to hide the truth, the scriptures reveal it.
Wow.
It is, so for instance, the scriptures also tells us the first civilization, the first city, is the city of the Canaanites, who was established by the first murderer, Cain.
Yeah.
So sin, sacrifice gone wrong, and the first human community is all mentioned in the very first story. Cain is the theological child of Adam and Eve who misconceived who God was.
Say that again. That is so good.
So Adam and Eve, who misconceives who God is, gives birth theologically to the first murderer. And so the first 11 chapters of Genesis continues to retell the same story. What is the story it tells? That the fundamental human problem, the way in which sin is expressed most explicitly, is in violence. And so the story develops that how shall we stop this violence? How shall we stop Cain from and people from murdering Cain? And so the only conception that they can come up with is retributive violence. So the way in which they conceive of God is a God who says, don't kill Cain, because if you kill him, I'm going to kill 7 of yours. I'm going to avenge his death sevenfold. And what happens a little bit later, what's his name? Lamech. He says, a young man struck me and I killed him. Now somebody can just strike you and you can kill him. And he says, if Cain was avenged 7 times, I will be avenged 70 times 7. In other words, the nature of violence is always to escalate. You kill one of our tribes, we'll kill 7 of yours. You'll kill one of our tribes again, we'll kill 70 times 7. There's no limit to retributive violence. But you see, violence remains evil, whether you initiated it or responded with it. The only thing that changed is the sequence. And so by the time we get to the Noah story, what is the fundamental problem that is identified? The desires of their hearts were evil continually. And what was the result of that? Violence filled the earth. And so in this story, there is the first attempt to undo man's mythology. Remember what man's mythology said? The community is right, the minority is wrong. But the Noah story is the first story that suggests to us that maybe the community is guilty and the minority is righteous. Yeah. Maybe God is on the side of the victims. So all of the scriptures is starting this process of telling the story from the point of view of the victim. And that makes the scriptures unique. You see, this is why the God revealed to Israel, one of the first commandments is, you cannot make any image of this God. Why not? Because every other government, every other empire had a very clear image of their God. Their God was the one who supported them. Their God was the one who continually told them how right they were and how wrong anyone was that opposed them. Their God was the one who justified their violence. They could identify and put the image on their God. And as we said before, if your God hates all the same people you hate, you can be sure that it's a God you created in your own image. Because the true God, if God is truly just, truly loving, it means that there's going to be times where he is not just on my side. And so what happens in Israel is this amazing thing, that their God cannot have an image because this God is going to choose his own image. And the image that this God chooses is the image of the victim. And that is an image that cannot be manipulated. You see, this is the first God who's on the side of the slaves, on the side of the outcasts, on the side of those who are pushed to the fringe of society. This is the God who continually threatens the current order. This is the God who continually threatens the status quo, because as long as there are victims, this God is not finished changing this world. As long as there are victims, this God is not on the side of the established order. As long as there are victims, this God doesn't just support your policy, your government, your society, your culture. This God is the God who continues to threaten societies that have been built on illusion and deception, to bring about a whole new way of being human. What time did you say we can go until? So what time are we stopping? Okay, so I'm going to go for another 10 minutes, then we're going to have 5 minutes break, and then we'll do the last session. So, this God, this God who chooses his own image, chooses to not be the one who just supports the status quo, but the one who identifies with the victim, the one who identifies with the outcast, the one whose image cannot be manipulated or controlled. And story after story, as we read through the scriptures, this myth of redemptive violence, this myth of an angry God who requires sacrifice, is being overturned. And so, even while the priests are writing up their precise prescriptions for sacrifice, the prophet starts speaking and says, your sacrifices and offerings I did not require. In other words, God has to come and speak to Israel, who's a nation like every other nation, who still believes in the power of sacrifice. Can't go into all the detail now, but Israel, like every other nation, practiced human sacrifice. Okay? The reason it was later condemned, and it's spoken against very clearly in later scripture, and the reason they speak against it is because it happened. Simple. They don't warn you, stop doing this because you're not. They say, stop doing it because you're busy doing it. And Jeremiah and Ezekiel has got different explanations. And why did they practice human sacrifice? Well, maybe it's because the very clear command in Exodus that says, where Yahweh says, give me the firstborn of your sons. And we think, oh, that must be a spiritual dedication. No, just after that, it's very clear in the context, give me the firstborn of your donkey, of your sons, etc. And if you can't give your donkey, because a donkey is more valuable in the agricultural community, then you can redeem the life of your donkey by breaking the neck of a goat. And by the way, you should really redeem the life of your firstborn as well. In other words, if you don't have a goat, you owe me your firstborn. And so ancient Israelite religion practiced human sacrifices just like every other religion in their area. Later on, when Jeremiah condemns this practice, he says, whoever gave you the idea to sacrifice your children? Yahweh never gave you this command, etc., etc. He denies that Yahweh ever did it. Ezekiel, on the other hand, feels that maybe he can't get away with just saying it wasn't Yahweh because it was so much part of their culture. So the way in which Ezekiel condemns it is by saying, you see, Yahweh was really ticked off at you. And so, because he wanted to desolate you, he gave you evil commands by which you made to pass through the fire the one who opens the wound, which was just a way in which to say the firstborn needs to be sacrificed in fire. So Ezekiel says, yes, it's part of our history. But it was just because God was ticked off at you. He's no longer mad. Stop it. He doesn't want the sacrifices anymore. So sacrifice was part of ancient Israelite religion, but God enters into a conversation with Israel as an example to all the nations to transform their idea about who God is, how sacrifice works, and who we are. And so when the most famous story, Abraham, give to me the firstborn, Isaac. Can you see that God makes the same request that any other false god made in that whole region? But something different is going to happen here. Because just as Abraham's about to cut his throat, God stops him and says, stop. In other words, Abraham, I am not like any other God. If any sacrifice is to be made, it will be one that I supply. This might be, there's lots of theological speculation, but this might be the point and the story that was used to transform child sacrifice into animal sacrifice. At that stage. But God enters into conversation with us on a level that we can understand, and sacrifice was the only bloody language we could understand. And so that is where he starts speaking to us. But in all his conversation, he continually says, the cows on 1,000 hills are mine. If I wanted some blood, I wouldn't even ask you. I mean, I'll just suck them dry. I'm not in need of your blood, of your meat, of your sacrifices. I'm not like the God that you've imagined. You see, this image of a violent God was born in our own confusion. And Jesus, as we're going to see in the next session, is going to take us back to the original event that perverted our ideas of God. And in that event, he's going to inverse everything we believed about sacrifice, about God, about ourselves, about evil. Because language, what is language? Language is the symbols we use with which to describe the actual events that we experience. And specifically, if you can imagine the horrific event in which a community murders one of their own. But the effects are so enormous that you've got to somehow justify this event, because we need to, the choice is many die or one die. And so the choice is continually made. we've got to find a way to justify the murder of the victim. And sacrificial religious language becomes the holy mask under which the most satanic murder is hidden. But we continue in our language to not only explain what happened, but also to hide the disturbing nature of what we experience. So language is not just used to describe reality. It's often used to hide reality. So the myths would hide the horror of the murder. So for instance, the Mayan myth. Somebody had to be sacrificed in fire to make sure that the sun would rise. So they asked for volunteers. No one had the courage because the fire was so brutally hot. And so they saw one little man sitting in a corner full of postulates. You see something different about this man. He must just be a little bit of a loner. It's somebody a bit who won't have many reprisals. So they asked him, won't you do the honor to our God and volunteer to be the sacrificed? And so he volunteered. And he walked to the edge of the fire, and he walked back because he did not have the courage. He did this 3 times, but he did not have the courage to jump. But with the encouragement of his brothers who made a circle around him, he eventually voluntarily jumped and was burned to death, and the sun rose again the next day. Can you see that there is a real victim and there's real events behind the myth? But there's also a part of the myth that hides the horror of murder. So we were innocent. We just encouraged our brother to volunteer. The truth is somebody was murdered. And our myths kind of contains a bit of the truth, but a bit of the part that justifies ourselves. And so we cannot break free from the, especially when that myth is transferred from one generation to a next, to a generation that has not actually experienced the original event. All they have is the story. They don't have the actual experience. Now the story starts taking on a life and a personality of its own that gets further and further removed from the reality it once described. And nowhere is the confusion between, listen here, nowhere is the confusion between language and the reality it describes more acute than in religious text. And so in religious text we need to, this is what Jesus is going to come and do. He's going to take us back to those graves that we've whitewashed. Wow. That we don't even know that we're walking over dead men's bones. We've made it a religious shrine. We've made it as part of our sacrificial worship language, never recognizing the horrific murder that gave birth to our religious practices. He's going to come and take us back to the original event. Because once you remove the language and the story from the event, there's a certain amount of conversation that needs to happen, that can happen to reframe our thinking. But eventually, no amount of argument is going to set you free from that myth. Wow. What you need is to come face to face with the original event. And when you're face to face with that original event, then you can tell a new story about what actually happened. And so we're going to take a 5-minute break until 8 o'clock. And then we're going to do the last part, and that is to look how Jesus comes to summarize this whole story and bring about an atonement, restore desire, and in that way transform society and give us an opportunity to be human in a completely new way of being human. Now, during